The desert wind, a relentless sculptor of sand and bone, whispered secrets across the arid expanse of Kandahar. It spoke of battles fought, of sacrifices made, and of a promise whispered in the heat haze, a promise of a better tomorrow for Afghanistan and for the men who bled for it. Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, his face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles and the grim lines of command, felt that wind on his weathered skin. It was a familiar caress, one he'd known for years, a constant companion to the acrid scent of cordite and the metallic tang of fear. He watched his unit, Bravo Company, 75th Ranger Regiment, move with practiced efficiency across the dusty parade ground of Forward Operating Base, FOB, Scorpion. They were a symphony of disciplined chaos, their Kevlar vests gleaming dully under the unforgiving sun, their M4 carbines held at the ready, even in moments of supposed peace. These men, these warriors, were his lifeblood. He knew them not just by their ranks and their call signs, but by the flicker in their eyes when they spoke of home, by the quiet hum of their shared anxieties, by the fierce loyalty that bound them tighter than any military regulation. There was Corporal Mateo "Matty" Rodriguez, his dark eyes often holding a faraway look, a yearning for the vibrant streets of Chicago he'd left behind. Matty, a whiz with explosives, could disarm a roadside bomb with a surgeon's precision, his hands steady even when the ground trembled beneath him. He'd saved Thorne's life more than once, a silent guardian angel in the crucible of war. Thorne remembered the day Matty had pulled him from the wreckage of a Humvee, the acrid smoke stinging his lungs. Matty's voice, surprisingly calm, guiding him through the inferno. "Easy, Sarge. We're gonna get you out. Just breathe." Then there was Specialist Anya Sharma, the medic, her small frame belying a spirit of iron. Anya, with her gentle hands and her unwavering resolve, had patched up more bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries than Thorne cared to count. She carried the weight of every life she couldn't save, a burden that etched itself onto her young face. Thorne had seen her weep silently in the dead of night, the ghosts of fallen comrades haunting her dreams. Yet with the first hint of dawn, she would be back on her feet, her resolve renewed, ready to face another day of unimaginable horror. And Sergeant First Class Ben Carter, the stoic, the unwavering, Ben, with his quiet strength and his unwavering sense of duty, was the anchor of the unit. He rarely spoke of his family back in rural Georgia, but Thorne saw the way his eyes softened when he scrolled through pictures on his worn phone, the phantom touch of his daughter's hand on his cheek. Ben was the kind of man who would walk into hell for his brothers, and Thorne knew that without question. They had fought for America. They had answered the call when their nation demanded it, leaving behind everything they held dear, families, futures, dreams, to serve in a land far from home. They had endured scorching heat, biting sandstorms, and the constant gnawing fear of the unseen enemy. They had witnessed atrocities that would scar a lesser soul and performed acts of bravery that defied comprehension. They had been the tip of the spear, the shield, the sword, all for the promise of a safer America, a world free from the shadows of terror. Thorne himself had come to this war a different man than the one who had enlisted 2 decades prior. The eager young recruit, brimming with idealism, had been forged in the fires of combat into something harder, something more resilient. He carried the weight of command with a weary grace, his decisions often fraught with the agonizing knowledge that lives hung in the balance. He had seen friends fall, their laughter silenced forever, their dreams extinguished in a flash of fire. He had held dying men in his arms, their last breaths a ragged plea for their mothers, their wives, their children. He had learned to compartmentalize, to push down the grief and the horror, to focus on the mission, on the survival of his men. The mission in Afghanistan had been long, arduous, and, in Thorne's increasingly cynical view, increasingly futile. The initial surge of purpose, the clear-cut objective of dismantling Al-Qaeda, had blurred into a complex, unending quagmire. Nation-building, insurgency, counter-terrorism. The rhetoric had shifted, the goals had become nebulous, and the cost, in human lives and shattered spirits, had remained brutally constant. Yet they had persevered. They had believed in the mission, in the sacrifices they were making, in the narrative that their efforts were forging a better future. They had believed, above all, in America. They believed in the ideals it represented, in the freedom it championed, in the promise that their service would be honored, their sacrifices remembered. Now the wind carried a different whisper, a chilling premonition that something had shifted. The news from home, filtered through patchy satellite connections and the hushed tones of officers, spoke of a changing tide. The war was unpopular, the cost too high, the objectives unclear. There were voices, loud and insistent, questioning the purpose of their deployment, the wisdom of their sacrifices. Thorne felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. He had seen the political winds shift before, but this felt different. This felt like a betrayal. He looked at the faces of his men, etched with the weariness of prolonged combat, yet still holding a spark of unwavering dedication. They had put their lives on the line for America. They had answered its call without hesitation. And now it seemed America was beginning to question them. The dust swirled, obscuring the distant mountains, mirroring the growing uncertainty in Thorne's mind. The promise of a better tomorrow, once a beacon of hope, was beginning to feel like a distant mirage, shimmering and unattainable in the unforgiving desert heat. The wind, once a herald of duty and purpose, now seemed to carry the first icy tendrils of doubt, a chilling omen of what was to come. They had fought for America, and the unspoken fear gnawed at Thorne. What if America was no longer fighting for them? The static crackled, a familiar, unwelcome companion to the late-night silence that usually settled over FOB Scorpion like a shroud of dust. Thorne, his Kevlar vest still a heavy presence even when unbuckled, nursed a lukewarm cup of coffee, the bitter taste doing little to cut through the gnawing exhaustion. He'd been staring at the same patch of cracked linoleum in his cramped office for what felt like hours, each tiny fissure a roadmap of the relentless pressure that had become his life. Outside, the Afghan night hummed with the low thrum of generators and the distant, mournful cry of a muezzin. But it was the silence inside his head that was the most deafening. The words from the latest encrypted message from command still echoed, a discordant symphony of political maneuvering and shifting priorities. Strategic reassessment. Exit strategies. Public opinion. Words that felt like a betrayal, a gut punch delivered from 1,000 miles away by people who'd never felt the searing heat of an IED detonation or the metallic tang of fear in their own mouths. He thought of Maddie, his EOD specialist, meticulously dismantling a complex device just last week, his brow furrowed in concentration, sweat beading on his upper lip. Maddie, who dreamed of opening a taco truck back in Chicago, of the simple rhythm of serving food, not disarming death. Thorne pictured Maddie's hands, steady and sure as he worked, hands that were now, Thorne suspected, beginning to tremble with a different kind of dread. And Anya? Specialist Sharma, her small frame belying the immense strength she possessed. Thorne had seen her, time and again, emerge from the chaos of a casualty evacuation, her face etched with a grief that no amount of training could erase, yet her eyes always holding a spark of fierce determination. She patched up their broken bodies, but Thorne worried about the invisible wounds she carried, the ones that festered in the quiet moments between the screams. He'd heard her speaking softly to a young private, barely out of his teens, who'd lost both legs. Her voice, usually a clear, steady stream, had cracked with a raw empathy that Thorne had felt deep in his own bones. What would happen to her, to all of them, if the mission here was deemed unnecessary? Ben Carter, Sergeant First Class, his stoic anchor. Thorne imagined Ben back in his small Georgia town, the smell of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the acrid scent of cordite that clung to them all. Ben, who rarely spoke of his family, but whose worn photograph, tucked into the breast pocket of his uniform, spoke volumes. Thorne wondered if Ben's wife, Sarah, still wrote him letters filled with the mundane details of their lives, or if the news from here, the whispers of doubt and discontent, had begun to cast a shadow over their quiet existence. The radio on his desk crackled to life, jolting Thorne from his reverie. "Scorpion Actual, this is Bravo 2. Over." Thorne reached for the handset, his voice rough. "Scorpion Actual, go ahead, Bravo 2. Over." "Sergeant Major, we've got movement on the northern perimeter. Thermal signatures, looks like a small group, moving fast. Over." The voice of Sergeant Davies, his usual steady cadence tinged with a hint of urgency. Thorne's mind snapped into focus, the internal turmoil momentarily silenced by the ever-present demands of the mission. "Acknowledged, Bravo 2. Maintain observation. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Report any changes. Scorpion Actual, out." He leaned back, the worn leather of his chair groaning in protest. The desert, a relentless sculptor of sand and bone, was their constant adversary. But lately, the enemy felt closer, more insidious. It wasn't just the insurgents hiding in the shadows, the IEDs buried beneath the dust. It was the creeping doubt, the gnawing suspicion that the very people they were fighting for had begun to forget them. He stood and walked to the small barred window, peering out into the darkness. The moon, a sliver of bone against the inky sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the dusty parade ground. It was a scene he'd witnessed countless times, a symphony of disciplined chaos, the hum of machinery, the hushed voices of guards on patrol. But tonight, it felt different. The familiar sounds seemed muted, the shadows deeper, more menacing. He remembered the initial deployment, the palpable sense of purpose, the unwavering belief that they were on the right side of history, the tip of the spear, the shield, the sword of justice. They had believed in the mission, in the promises whispered in briefing rooms and shouted across dusty parade grounds. They had believed in America. Now the promises felt thin, brittle. The support, once a roaring inferno, seemed to be sputtering, reduced to embers. Thorne ran a hand over his grizzled jaw, the stubble a testament to days blurred into nights. He was a soldier. His duty was to his men, to bring them home alive, to ensure their sacrifices were not in vain. But how could he do that when the very ground beneath them seemed to be shifting? A chill, unrelated to the desert night, snaked its way up his spine. It was a chilling premonition, an icy tendril of doubt that wrapped around his heart. They had fought for America. They had bled for America. They had buried friends, comrades, who had given their last breath for America. And now, it felt as though America was turning its back on them. The thought was a bitter pill, harder to swallow than any ration pack. He turned back to his desk, the blinking cursor on his laptop screen a silent accusation. He had reports to file, intelligence to analyze, men to lead. But the weight of the unspoken was heavy, pressing down on him. What was the point of it all, if the home front had lost faith? If the politicians, in their air-conditioned offices, had decided the cost was too high, the reward too intangible? He thought of the faces of his men, the hope in their eyes when they spoke of home, the quiet pride when they spoke of their service. They had answered the call. They had stood tall when others faltered. They had believed in the idea of America, in its ideals, in its promise of a better future. And Thorne, their sergeant major, was beginning to fear that America no longer believed in them. The thought was a betrayal deeper than any enemy bullet. It was a quiet erosion, a slow poisoning of the very spirit that drove them. He looked at the photograph of his own family, tucked into a corner of his desk, their smiling faces a distant, almost unreal memory. He fought for them, for their safety, for the future they deserved. But what if that future was one where their sacrifices were just footnotes in a forgotten war? The radio crackled again. Scorpion Actual, Bravo 2. Contact confirmed. Hostiles are attempting to breach the eastern fence. Over. Thorne's hand tightened on the handset. The internal debate, the existential dread, had to be pushed aside. For now, his duty was here, with his men, on this dusty, unforgiving ground. He took a deep breath, the scent of dust and diesel filling his lungs. Bravo 2, this is Scorpion Actual, he said, his voice resonating with a renewed, if weary, authority. Engage. Hold the line. I'm en route with support. Over. He stood, the weight of his Kevlar vest a familiar burden. He grabbed his M4 carbine, the cold metal a solid, tangible presence in his hands. He would fight. They would fight. Not just for America, but for each other. For the belief, however fragile, that their fight, their sacrifice, still mattered. But as he strode out of his office, into the pre-dawn chill, the icy tendrils of doubt remained. A stark reminder of the war that was being waged not just on distant battlefields, but within the very heart of the nation they served. The question, a silent scream in the vast desert night, echoed. What happens when the home you fight for turns on you? The perimeter alarm shrieked, a raw, jagged sound that sliced through the oppressive quiet of the desert night. It wasn't the usual distant thrum of artillery or the sporadic pop of small arms fire that had become the unsettling lullaby of Phoebe Scorpion. This was immediate, a siren's wail that clawed at Thorne's gut. He was already on his feet, the worn Kevlar vest a familiar, heavy embrace, his M4 carbine clutched with practiced ease. The air, thick with the acrid scent of cordite from earlier exchanges, now vibrated with a new, chilling intensity. Contact! Sergeant First Class Ben Carter's voice, usually a low rumble, was tight with urgency over the comms. Multiple vectors, east side. They're pushing hard. Thorne didn't need the confirmation. He could feel it in the tremor of the ground, in the sudden, frantic chatter of incoming fire that hammered against the FOB's outer defenses. The enemy, emboldened by the encroaching darkness, and perhaps by the very same doubts that gnawed at him, had chosen this moment to strike. It was a symphony of disciplined chaos, the kind he'd orchestrated countless times. But tonight, the conductor's baton felt heavier, the score more ominous. Matty, report! Thorne barked into his radio, his voice a low growl that cut through the rising din. Corporal Mateo Rodriguez, the unit's EOD specialist, was usually the first to identify the nature of the threat, his keen eyes and even keener mind sifting through the chaos for the telltale signs of an impending IED or a coordinated assault. Copy, Sergeant Major, Matty's voice crackled back, a faint tremor beneath the practiced calm. Looks like a mix of RPGs and small arms, but they're using some kind of heavy machine gun too. Trying to pinpoint the source. His words were punctuated by the sharp retort of his own weapon, a staccato rhythm against the louder, more sustained enemy fire. Thorne pictured him, hunched behind a sandbagged emplacement, his face illuminated by the tactical display of his gear, the metallic tang of fear, a constant companion. Sharma, status on casualties? Thorne continued, his gaze sweeping across the dusty parade ground, now a maelstrom of muzzle flashes and dust clouds. Specialist Anya Sharma, their medic, was already moving, her small frame a beacon of determined purpose amidst the growing urgency. "Minimal so far, Sergeant Major." Anya's voice was steady, though Thorne could detect the subtle strain, the unspoken burden of the lives she was sworn to protect. Just a couple of minor concussions from the blast wave, keeping a close eye. She was a paradox, a fragile vessel carrying an immense reservoir of strength and compassion. Thorne trusted her implicitly, more than he trusted the pronouncements from distant generals. "Carter, reinforce Sector 5. Thorne 1-1, Thorne 1-2, push to the breach point. Let's give them a taste of what they've been missing." Thorne grabbed his helmet, the familiar weight settling onto his head. The comms crackled with the urgent call signs of his men, the disciplined voices a testament to years of shared hardship and unwavering loyalty. They were the tip of the spear, the shield, the sword, and tonight, they were the last line of defense. He moved with a weary grace, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The heat haze of the day had long since dissipated, replaced by a cool desert night, but the air still felt heavy, charged with anticipation. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every gust of wind whispered of unseen threats. He saw Ben Carter, a silhouette against the faint glow of the fob lights, directing his squad with quiet authority. Carter was the bedrock of their unit, a man whose stoicism was as dependable as the sunrise, though Thorne suspected the quiet strength he projected masked a gnawing worry for his family back in rural Georgia. Thorne joined a patrol moving towards the eastern perimeter, the beam of his tactical flashlight cutting a narrow swathe through the darkness. The steady rhythm of their boots on the hard-packed earth was a drumbeat against the escalating chaos. The air grew hotter, thicker, as they neared the source of the enemy's assault. The acrid smell of cordite was now overpowering, mingling with the metallic tang of fear and the faint, earthy scent of the desert itself. "They're using thermobaric rounds," Maddie's voice cut through the comms again, laced with a grim certainty. "Trying to flush us out. Heavy ordnance, Sergeant Major. They've got a significant push planned." A chilling premonition, a cold knot of dread, tightened in Thorne's stomach. This wasn't just a probing attack. This was an attempt to shatter their defenses, to exploit any perceived weakness. And the weakness, he knew, wasn't in their training or their courage. It was in the growing disconnect, the icy tendrils of doubt that had begun to creep in from home. He'd seen it in the news clips, heard it in the muted conversations of his men, felt it in the increasingly cautious directives from command. America, the nation they fought for, seemed to be forgetting them, or worse, questioning the very sacrifices they made. "Sergeant Major, visual on the breach." Thorne's own call sign, Thorne 1-0, was a steady anchor in the storm. He saw it then, a ragged tear in the wire, a dark maw spewing fire and fury. Insurgents, silhouetted against the muzzle flashes, were pouring through, their dark clothing blending with the night. The guttural shouts of their attack, a primal roar, filled the air. "Engage!" Thorne shouted, the command torn from his throat. His M4 came up, the familiar weight a comfort, the glowing reticle a deadly promise. He fired, a controlled burst, the recoil a familiar jolt against his shoulder. Around him, his men unleashed a hail of fire, their discipline a stark contrast to the frenzied assault. The desert night, usually a canvas of stars, was now a brutal, flickering inferno. Maddie's voice, strained but resolute, crackled over the comms. "Sergeant Major, they're planting something near the breach. Looks like a mine." "Big one." Thorne's blood ran cold. An IED designed to sow maximum devastation if they tried to seal the breach. This was calculated, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. He saw the glint of metal, the telltale shape of an anti-personnel mine, nestled just inside the torn perimeter. "Maddie, can you get to it?" Thorne asked, his voice low, tight with concern. He knew the risks. Matty was their best, their most skilled, but even he was not invincible. "Working on it, Sergeant Major," Matty replied, the sound of his own movement, a muffled scramble audible over the radio. "Gonna take some fancy footwork." Thorne watched, his breath held tight in his chest, as Matty, a shadow moving with impossible speed and precision, navigated the treacherous ground. The enemy fire continued to rain down, a constant barrage designed to keep them pinned, to prevent any counteroffensive. He saw Anya, her face grim, tending to a soldier who'd taken a glancing blow, her movements swift and efficient. Ben Carter was a blur of controlled motion, rallying his men, his voice a steady command in the chaos. "Almost there," Matty grunted, the sound strained. Thorne could see him, a small figure silhouetted against the distant lights of the fob, inching closer to the planted mine. The air thrummed with tension, the fate of the entire sector hanging precariously in the balance. Thorne felt a surge of something akin to despair. These men, his men, bled for this country, endured unimaginable hardship, and here they were, fighting for their very lives against an enemy that seemed to have an endless supply of courage and ordnance. And all the while, the ground beneath their feet, the very foundation of their mission, felt as unstable as shifting sand. Then a deafening roar, not the sharp crack of small arms fire, but a deep concussive blast that shook the very foundations of the fob. Thorne was thrown to his knees, his ears ringing. Dust and debris billowed into the air, obscuring his vision. "Matty!" Thorne roared, scrambling back to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Matty, report!" Silence. A terrifying, suffocating silence on the comms, broken only by the distant sounds of ongoing fighting. Thorne's mind raced, a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles etched with a chilling premonition. He knew, with a certainty that settled like cold lead in his gut, that the enemy had achieved a partial victory. They had managed to sow chaos, to inflict a wound. And in that moment, as the desert night continued to rage around him, Sergeant Major Elias Thorne wondered, with a profound and aching weariness, if America even noticed. The blast had been a physical blow, a concussive wave that slammed into Thorne's chest, even from his position near the command post. The air, already thick with the acrid bite of cordite and the metallic tang of fear, now tasted of pulverized concrete and something far more sickening. Dust billowed, a choking shroud that swallowed the eastern perimeter in a sudden, violent darkness. The cacophony of the assault, a symphony of disciplined chaos moments before, fractured into panicked shouts and the ragged tearing of metal. "Matty!" Thorne's voice, usually a gravelly rumble that could cut through any din, was a raw, desperate cry. He pushed off the sandbagged wall, his Kevlar vest suddenly feeling like a leaden weight. His eyes, squinting through the swirling grit, scanned the area where Rodriguez had been just moments before. The mine, a brutal punctuation mark in the enemy's desperate offensive, had detonated with a ferocity that defied its size. Around him, the remnants of the perimeter defense fought on. Bullets whined, ricocheting off hardened earth and metal. The rhythmic thud of heavy machine gun fire from the FOB's turrets provided a grim counterpoint to the crackle of small arms. But Thorne's focus was laser-sharp, a single point of agonizing uncertainty in the maelstrom. "Medic! EOD team!" he barked into his radio, his voice tight with a dread he hadn't felt since the early days, before the grim arithmetic of survival had become second nature. "Eastern breach point, report status." Anya Sharma's voice, strained but steady, crackled back. "On my way, Sergeant Major. Moving from the aid station now. 2 wounded en route to surgical." Her words were clipped, professional, a testament to the years of training that had honed her into a surgeon in a combat zone. But Thorne heard the tremor beneath the surface, the unspoken fear that mirrored his own. Sergeant First Class Ben Carter, his face a mask of grim determination, was already moving towards the breach. His M4 carbine was held at the ready, his movements economical and purposeful. He met Thorne's gaze, a silent question passing between them. Thorne gave a curt nod, a command to proceed with caution, to assess the situation. Thorne followed, the dust clinging to his uniform, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The closer he got, the more horrific the scene became. The earth where Maddie had been working was churned into a crater, littered with twisted metal and shards of what had once been a mine. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wiring and something else. Something that made Thorne's stomach clench. He saw movement. A figure, partially obscured by debris, stirred. It was Ramirez, one of the younger infantrymen, his face streaked with blood and dirt. He was on his hands and knees, groaning. "Ramirez, you all right?" Thorne knelt beside him, his hand hovering over the young soldier's shoulder. My legs, Sergeant Major?" Ramirez gasped, his voice a thin thread. "Can't feel 'em." Thorne's gaze flickered to the crater. The mine had been a booby trap, designed not just to breach the perimeter, but to inflict maximum casualties. He saw it then, a dark, irregular mass partially buried in the freshly turned earth, just beyond the lip of the crater. Another mine. And then he saw the faint, almost invisible tripwire snaking its way from that second mine towards the path Maddie would have taken to get to it. "Damn it!" Thorne breathed, the realization hitting him like another blast. Maddie hadn't been caught by the first mine. He'd been trying to disarm the second one when the first had detonated, likely triggered remotely or by a secondary device. The enemy had anticipated their response. They had planned for this. Anya arrived then, her medic bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes sharp and assessing. She immediately went to Ramirez, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Thorne pointed to the second mine. "Anya, stay clear. Ben, get eyes on that. Don't touch anything." Carter had already spotted it. He circled warily, his rifle sweeping the area. "Looks like another pressure plate, Sergeant Major. And that tripwire, it's connected to the first one, or something else. Could be a daisy chain." The realization settled over Thorne like a shroud. Maddie, his quiet, unassuming EOD specialist, who had earned his stripes and Thorne's profound respect by saving his life on more than one occasion, was gone. Not just gone, but likely caught in the very trap he was trying to disarm. A wave of profound weariness washed over Thorne, a fatigue that went deeper than any physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of a war that seemed to have no end, of sacrifices that felt increasingly meaningless. They fought for a country that seemed to be forgetting them, a nation whose attention was increasingly fractured, its resolve dissolving like sand in the unforgiving wind. "Sergeant Major?" Anya's voice broke through his grim reverie. She had finished her initial assessment of Ramirez. "He's got nerve damage, likely temporary, but it's bad. We need to get him back to the TOC." She looked at Thorne, her eyes holding a question he couldn't answer. "And Corporal Rodriguez?" Thorne looked at the crater, at the grim tableau of destruction. He saw the twisted metal, the churned earth, the lingering scent of death. He saw the faint, almost invisible line of the tripwire that had claimed his soldier. "We don't know, Specialist," Thorne said, his voice rough. He stood up, sweeping his gaze across the embattled perimeter. The enemy assault, though momentarily blunted, was still a tangible threat. The breach point was a gaping wound, and the fight to seal it was far from over. "We don't know." He keyed his radio. "All units, this is Thorne. Bravo Company is engaged. Eastern perimeter is holding, but we have casualties. EOD Specialist Mateo Rodriguez is unaccounted for. Repeat, Rodriguez is unaccounted for. All units, maintain defensive posture. We will not yield this ground." The words felt hollow, a familiar mantra in a war that had stripped away all pretense of glory. They fought for America, for the ideals it supposedly represented. But as Thorne looked at the devastation, at the faces of his weary soldiers, a chilling premonition tightened its icy grip around his heart. What if America wasn't fighting for them anymore? What if their sacrifices, their very lives, had become an inconvenient footnote in a nation's weary march towards… What? A negotiated peace? A quiet withdrawal? He signaled to Carter. Get a team to secure that second mine. Slowly, carefully. We need to know what we're dealing with. He turned back to Anya. Get Ramirez back. And Anya, keep an eye on the men. This is going to hit them hard. As Anya and Carter's teams moved with painstaking deliberation, Thorne watched the dust settle, revealing the raw, brutal reality of the battlefield. The sun, a relentless sculptor of sand and bone, began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the fob. Each shadow seemed to hold a ghost, a reminder of the lives lost, the futures extinguished. He thought of Matty, his quiet competence, his easy smile that had rarely reached his eyes in this God-forsaken place. Matty, who had talked about opening a small auto repair shop in Chicago, about finally seeing his nieces and nephews grow up. All those dreams, now buried beneath the unforgiving sand. The fight for the eastern perimeter continued, a desperate, grinding struggle. But for Elias Thorne, a different battle had begun. A battle against the creeping despair, against the gnawing doubt that whispered in the quiet moments between the explosions, a battle to find meaning in the chaos and to hold on to the faint embers of hope in a war that threatened to consume them all. The nation they served was a distant echo, a fading ideal. All that remained was the mission, the men and women beside him, and the grim, unyielding duty to see them through. But even that, he knew, was becoming harder to believe in with each passing hour. Dust, thick and cloying, still hung in the air, a gritty shroud that clung to sweat-slicked Kevlar and choked the lungs. The cacophony of the eastern perimeter's assault had subsided, replaced by the ragged breathing of men and women who had stared into the abyss and, for now, held the line. Sergeant Major Elias Thorne stood near the hastily repaired breach, his gaze sweeping over the scene, a landscape etched with the brutal artistry of conflict. The acrid scent of cordite still warred with the metallic tang of blood, a nauseating perfume that had become the signature scent of his life. His mind, however, was a battlefield all its own. Matty. The name echoed in the hollow chambers of his skull, a relentless drumbeat of despair. Corporal Mateo Rodriguez, the quiet EOD specialist whose hands had danced with death on countless occasions, had been swallowed by the earth, a victim of the very enemy he so expertly disarmed. Thorne's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the grim lines of command etched into his face. He'd seen men fall before, too many to count, but Matty had been different. A quiet competence, a flicker of home in his eyes when he spoke of Chicago, a life that now seemed impossibly distant, a ghost of a dream. Thorne's gut twisted. He hadn't even been able to confirm it. The secondary explosion had been a brutal punctuation mark, silencing any hope of immediate confirmation. The chaos of the breach, the enemy pressing in, had forced them to focus on survival, on holding the line. Matty was listed as missing, presumed lost, presumed. The word felt like a lead weight in Thorne's chest. He turned, his gaze falling on Specialist Anya Sharma, her small frame radiating an exhaustion that went bone deep. She was meticulously tending to a young private with a shrapnel wound in his thigh, her movements precise, her voice a low, calming murmur. Yet Thorne saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, the silent acknowledgement of the lives she'd fought to save, and the ones she hadn't. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that she would be carrying the weight of Maddie's fate too, even without a body to identify. Medics saw the rawest edges of war, the brutal aftermath, and Anya bore that burden with a weary grace that Thorne both admired and feared for her. Sergeant First Class Ben Carter, his stoic anchor, was barking orders, coordinating the remnants of the perimeter defense. His face, usually a mask of impassive duty, was streaked with grime, his eyes sharp and alert, scanning the tree line for any sign of renewed enemy activity. Thorne saw the familiar tension in his shoulders, the quiet strength that had always been the bedrock of Thorne's command. Carter was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes, a testament to the unwavering discipline that Thorne had instilled in Bravo Company. Thorne felt a flicker of gratitude for Carter's steadfastness, a small ember in the encroaching darkness. The fight for the perimeter had been brutal, a desperate struggle against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the very dust. They had thrown everything they had at FOB Scorpion, testing its defenses, probing for weaknesses. And they had found one. The breach had been a moment of sheer terror, the sound of their M4 carbines spitting fire a desperate counterpoint to the guttural roars of the attackers. Thorne had seen men charge into the breach, witness the grim ballet of combat, the controlled chaos of their training kicking in. He'd felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the cold, sharp focus that war demanded. But beneath it all, a gnawing unease had begun to fester, a premonition that had been growing for weeks, months even. The news from back home, filtered through fragmented satellite calls and increasingly rare emails, had been a chilling counterpoint to the grim reality on the ground. Whispers of protests, of a populace weary of the endless war, of politicians questioning the cost, both human and financial. It was a dissonance that grated at Thorne's very soul. He and his men had bled for this country, had endured the unforgiving sun and the biting sandstorms, had faced down an enemy that sought to extinguish the very freedoms they held dear. They were the tip of the spear, the shield, the sword. And yet, it seemed, the hand that wielded them was beginning to falter, to question the very purpose of the fight. He remembered the early days, the fervent belief, the righteous anger that had fueled their deployment. They were coming home heroes, they'd been told. They were bringing democracy, stability. They were making a difference. But the landscape had shifted, the narrative had changed, and the lines between right and wrong had blurred into the dusty haze. The insurgency, once a tangible enemy, had become a hydra, its heads regenerating with a terrifying persistence. And now, it seemed, the war was becoming unpopular, a burden rather than a badge of honor. Thorne's gaze drifted to the mangled remains of a captured enemy weapon, a crude but effective device designed to sow terror. He'd seen enough of them. Each one represented a life potentially lost, a family shattered. And yet, the thought that America, his America, might be turning its back on the very sacrifices made to protect it, was a betrayal far more profound than any enemy attack. It was a chilling premonition that had settled upon him like the perpetual Afghan dust, a cold dread that whispered of a future where their efforts would be forgotten, their sacrifices unacknowledged, their very purpose questioned by the people they had sworn to protect. He walked towards the makeshift aid station, the scent of antiseptic a welcome, if temporary, reprieve from the lingering cordite. Anya looked up as he approached, her eyes meeting his with a shared understanding of the unspoken cost. "How are we looking, Doc?" Thorne's voice was rough, a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet hum of the FOB. Anya's shoulders sagged infinitesimally. "We've stabilized the critical cases, Sergeant Major. The private's going to pull through." "But—" She paused, her gaze flicking towards the direction of the EOD tent, a somber structure that now seemed to hold the weight of their collective grief. Maddie. Thorne nodded, the single word a heavy acknowledgement. No change? No, sir. Sergeant Miller is coordinating with the recovery teams, but it's not looking good. Her voice was barely a whisper. The explosion was significant. Thorne's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to rage, to scream at the indifferent sky, at the distant politicians, at the faceless enemy that had stolen one of his own. But rage was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was Sergeant Major Elias Thorne. He had a unit to lead, a perimeter to secure, a mission to somehow, impossibly, continue. "Keep them patched up, Anya," he said, his voice regaining a measure of its usual command, though the weariness was a palpable undercurrent. "We'll need every able body. And thank you. For everything." She offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze already returning to the young soldier, her focus recalibrating, her duty calling. Thorne turned away, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He looked out at the arid expanse, the horizon shimmering with heat haze, a mirage of peace that felt utterly alien. He found Carter near the command tent, his expression grim. "Perimeter's holding, Sergeant Major. We pushed them back, but they're regrouping. Expect another push before dawn." Thorne nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged peaks that rimmed the desert. "We're ready." The words were automatic, a reflex honed by years of combat. But the conviction behind them felt hollowed out, eroded by the growing certainty that their fight, their sacrifices, were becoming a footnote in a story that America was no longer interested in reading. "We lost Maddie, Sergeant Major," Carter said, his voice low, devoid of emotion, yet Thorne heard the unspoken grief, the shared loss. "I know, Ben." Thorne's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "I know." He thought of Maddie's eager smile when he'd received a care package from his family, the worn photograph of his younger sister he'd kept tucked in his helmet. That was what they were fighting for, wasn't it? The chance